Hi. So yesterday I recorded 3 videos and posted only 2 of them. I haven't made those public. I'll do that later today. But the third video, in which I wanted to give you some helpful ways to schematize the terms we're learning about this semester in your notebooks and also maybe just in your own minds. Uh, I kept that. I didn't upload that because I thought it was garbage. It was just sort of rambly and not very good and helpful. So today I'm re-recording this video after thinking about it overnight and this morning at a coffee shop, and I think I can do a better job right now. I'll post it later today. In fact, if you're watching this, it means I already have, and I'll make the first 2 public as well. The second one I also wasn't too happy with, but I hope there is some useful stuff there too. Anyway, okay, so you've probably already noticed that this semester the textbook we're using, Bennett and Royal's Literature, An Introduction to Literature Criticism and Theory, is throwing a barrage of terms at you, right? And terms that can be organized in a lot of different ways. So I want to go through the different kinds of terms that you're being introduced to, okay? The first kind of term would be the topics or titles of the various chapters we're reading, right? Those terms, the topics of the chapters we're reading, might best be understood, and you can write this in your notebook, as problems, right? Open problems that our textbook writers are claiming are worthy of investigation and that have been objects of investigation in literary studies for quite some time now. Okay. Not only that, because they are problems and remain problems and are and continue to be problematized by students in classrooms and scholars in their scholarship, they can also operate as good topics for your paper later this semester, and good topics for some of the short essays you'll be writing for your midterm and final exams too. Okay. So, for instance, you could write a paper about how Percy Shelley's poem "Darkness," which I just sort of mentioned in class, but which you had to read for class yesterday. So hopefully you did. The way in which, and I can just pull out the book now and look at the table of contents, how that poem in particular might help you think through. Actually, I didn't even need to open the book. How it helps you think through the uncanny. Right, but you can also do it in order to think through the problem of history, the problem of ghosts, the problem of desire, the problem of secrets, right? The problem of war, even, right? War figures heavily in that text, and so you could write a paper about how that poem enables you to think through those topics, or how those ideas are more than just simply thematized in the work of literature, but that the work of literature seems actively to be thinking about something related to those problems. Okay, and so your paper can be about unpacking how the literature does that. Okay, so that's the first kind of term. The titles of our chapters, open problems, right, that you can investigate in your papers, in your exams, in connection with works of literature. The second sort of terms involve our modes of criticism, right? And new criticism, reader response criticism, post-structuralist criticism, feminist criticism, all the sorts of criticism I list in the first sentence of my course description on the syllabus, right? And so as the book attempts to show you, each mode of criticism, although not simply how do I want to say this? Although each mode of criticism isn't necessarily completely coherent unto itself, you can have new critics that are at odds with each other about the best way to read a poem, just like you can have reader response critics who want to think about the relationship between the reader and the text in completely different ways. The book does show you this in chapter 2. Nevertheless, the modes of criticism sort of give you a spot to stand, right? Or an angle of vision, as one of my favorite writers might like to put it, from which to look at and read the literary text, right? And so a feminist critic may be particularly attuned to descriptions of women's bodies to the absence of women altogether, to the way in which objects or natural objects, both natural and man-made, are often referred to as using female figures. In short, a feminist critic would have a kind of investment in certain elements of the text that a new critic may completely miss, right? And so that's what emotive criticism does, right? It gives you a sort of, I don't want to say vague, but a sort but how about this? It gives you a sort of handle, right, for how to begin your investigation, or a stepping stone on which you can begin to build your investigation, or, like I said, an angle of vision through which to begin rethinking or re-seeing the work of literature that you're reading. Okay, so that's what emotive criticism is. And so in the chapters that investigate open problems, when Bennett and Royal walk through different modes of criticism, what they're attempting to do is show how different modes of criticism give different accounts of the same work of literature, because they're looking at it differently, because they're asking different questions, because they have different sympathies and sensitivities to certain elements of the text. Okay. And sometimes sensitivities, or a sensibility rather, maybe a better word, that is attuned to noticing what's missing in a text, right? Something that a lot of these modes of criticism actually are interested in investigating. Okay, so open problems are the topics of each chapter. Modes of criticism are the ways in which one might begin to approach a work of literature, and one of the problems that could serve as a topic for literary investigation. Okay. Open problems, modes of criticism. The third sorts of terms that we've been learning about are the terms and the tools, the terms and the tools of these modes of criticism. So one I've brought up over and over again because it is pretty important, and one that I will probably be shooting a lecture about in maybe even later today or tomorrow, is the intentional fallacy. Okay, I sort of went over that, I think, in the last video, or maybe I did it in the video that I'm not putting up. I don't really know. I'm not going to go into it here. But you'll note that the intentional fallacy is a term, right, that is closely associated with new criticism, that is sort of an anchor or a justification for how they pose questions to a literary text, or how they investigate, the tensions, paradoxes, and ambiguities of a literary text. Paradox, ambiguity, these are also terms and tools of new criticism. Okay. All right. So I hope that makes sense, right? So whenever you're doing your notes, try to think about, when you're thinking about a term, ask yourself, is it a problem that the book is investigating, right? Is it a topic of one of the chapters? Is it a mode of criticism, right? Or is it a term or a tool associated with one of those modes of criticism? All right. So ask yourself those three questions, and that will help you organize, I think, that the list of terms that I've been putting in my announcements on Sakai. Okay. So just for an example, let's look in chapter 4, the text and the world. Okay. So this chapter is all about the problem of the relationship between a literary text, or what I often call a work of literature, and the world in which we read it, the world in which the author wrote it, the world in which it continues to occupy bookshelves. Okay. All right. So we know right from the get-go, text and the world is an open problem, right? It's a topic that Bennett and Royal investigate through a reading of a very canonical poem, Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress, which is on pages 29 to 30. Okay, so they use that poem to break open and pursue and follow right, that problematic relationship between the text and the world. Now, I want to read the paragraph running from 28 to 29. I'll read it out loud, and just to give you a sense of how they begin to articulate the problem itself. Okay. The relationship between literary texts and the world, they write, again, this is page 28, has been a central problem in criticism and theory at least since the 4th century BC, when Plato banished poets from his imaginary republic. Plato, famous ancient Greek philosopher, banished poets from his imaginary republic for allegedly misrepresenting the world. The phrase "the text and the world," however, immediately presents a questionable distinction. Its very formation presupposes a difference between a text on the one hand and the world on the other. And that's a distinction that would be very important to new critics, for instance, right? The new critic needs there to be this distinction between the world and the text so that they can cordon the text off from, right, questions about history, questions about cultural context, and also questions about the author and the reader, okay? That they really want to objectify and focus closely just on the literature itself, okay? They go on to write, this distinction is, of course, a very common way of thinking about literature. It is implicit in a certain understanding of mimesis, or imitation, and in notions of realism and naturalism, which hopefully you'll learn about in other courses, and of representation, as well as in metaphors, which suggest that literary texts offer a window onto the world, in Hamlet's words, or in Hamlet's words, hold a mirror up to nature. All of these ways of thinking about literary texts start from an assumed separation of the literary work, the text, from the world. They imply that a literary text is not, in essence, part of the world. Actually, over the centuries, writers have been trying to drive a stake into the heart of that assumption. The text-world dichotomy is like a vampire that will not lie down. The latest and most persistent of these vampire killers are called poststructuralists. One of the most interesting descriptions of poststructuralists I've ever read. Poststructuralism, including new historicism, deconstruction, certain forms of feminism, postcolonialism, and queer theory, consistently undermines the very terms of this text-world dichotomy. In other words, they begin to problematize the relationship between text and world that new critics just kind of like to, once and for all sever and not worry about, okay? That they don't want to problematize. Michel Foucault puts the point in a Nietzschean way. Quote, if language expresses, it does so not so far as it is an imitation and duplication of things, but insofar as it manifests the fundamental will of those who speak it, end quote. Poststructuralists ask what it means to say that a literary text is different from, separate from the world. Shouldn't we say, rather, that such texts actually make up our world? Poststructuralists, I should say, are not the only ones who ask this, okay? Edward Said also does, and I doubt he would have appreciated being called a poststructuralist. How can an act of inscription or an act of reading not be part of the world? Is there a world without such acts? In a later chapter, we look at the way in which texts may be considered as performative, much later chapter, as acts of language which themselves do things, as well as just talk about things. In this chapter, we shall explore the idea that literary texts are acts that destabilize the very notion of the world, and that disturb all assumptions about a separation between world and text. Okay. So, what are we getting in this opening paragraph? We're getting some information and some demonstration of the way in which poststructuralism, one of our modes of criticism, is interested in problematizing, making a problem out of the topic of the relationship between the text and the world. Namely, they problematize how we understand a world at all, okay? And one of the theorists, someone I've brought up probably too many times by now, that is perhaps the most famous problematizer of the relationship between text and world, is, of course, Jacques Derrida. If you turn to page 31, We'll get to Derrida eventually, but at the top of the page, I do want to think about first an important distinction between two terms that are closely related with this mode of criticism, poststructuralism, which often goes after the problem or topic of the text in the world. Okay, so then an illustration of the three kinds of terms that we're learning about in this class. Skipping the first sentence at the top of 31, it can be shown, meaning the poem that Bennett and Royal are investigating here, that poem can be shown to engage with the world through the use of a number of specific discourses. Discourse, that's a term, an important term, that I hope I listed in the long list I put up a few days ago on Sakai. Okay, let's finish reading this paragraph and try to work through and think about how the word discourse, or the idea of discourses, can be a useful tool for posing questions to a literary text from the perspective of a certain mode of criticism. Okay, it can be shown to engage with the world through use of a number of specific discourses. The seduction in the poem is mediated not only by reference to other kinds of literary texts, poems of seduction, love poems, the blason, the carpe diem, or memento mori motif, and so on, but also in terms of other kinds of discourses: biblical, classical, colonial, philosophical, scientific, military. Skip the next sentence, read the last sentence of the paragraph. This complex jumble of discourses, biblical, classical, colonial, literary, philosophical, scientific, military, positions the text in relation to the world, even if we try to read the poem as simply fictional. Okay. So what does the word discourse mean here? If you look at the examples in the parentheses, these are examples of discourses: biblical discourse, classical discourse, colonial discourse, philosophical discourse, scientific discourse, military discourse. So discourse would then be a word that refers to a body of language that exists in some sense kind of separate from the poem, but that the poem nevertheless employs, and in employing it, then connects to the world of that discourse. Okay, let's flip to the back of into the glossary, page 321, because they give a nice definition of discourse there. They write, discourse can mean simply speech or language in general, right? Or language as we use it. But the term is often used in more theoretical contexts, like the ones that literary scholars work in, to signify the use of language associated with a particular institution, cultural identity, profession, practice, or discipline. And so when you listen to a scholar in the humanities specifically talk about how a politician may begin to adopt religious discourse in order to convince voters to put he or she in office, what they mean is that not that the politician may be a religious person, but that the politician is rhetorically drawing from a tradition of language usage that will be familiar to the people he's talking to, right? And because it's familiar, will endear him to those people. What's another good example? If you hear administrators at colleges, and not just administrators, advisors, professors, talk about how students should invest themselves more in their education, or should invest their education, or use a language of investment to talk about education, right? They are drawing on a particular discourse that is very prevalent right now, and pervasive in in post-secondary educational institutions, right? And what does this discourse do? It's an economical discourse, a financial discourse, right? The talk of investment, okay? And what does it do if we begin to think about it as a humanities person? What we might notice is that that sort of advice, which passes itself off as practical, passes itself off as sort of neutral in regard to questions of finance or economics, nevertheless has a stake in getting students and getting society to reimagine universities as places that you might call places of proto-job training, right? That what students are learning in their courses should be things that make them good workers in specific fields, right? Or in specific careers. Okay. And so when you talk to a student about investing in their education, you're asking them to think about the years they're putting into education as if they're putting money into a bank, and they'll be getting interest in return when they get out of school. And what will that interest be? It will be, a good start on a successful career. Okay. So that's an example of me problematizing not a literary text, but problematizing a use of language that is prevalent just in everyday speech about education, that borrows from the world, the discourse of economics and finances, right? And does so in a sort of sly way, in a way that seems to have nothing to do with economics or finances, but that nevertheless is rhetorically geared toward linking together future career success with education. Okay. You can do the same thing with poetry. You can, when you read poetry, pay attention to the kinds of language, which is another way of saying the discourses that the poet is drawing from in order to make figures, to make metaphors, to express complex feeling and emotion in the poetry. But you'll notice when you do that, you'll be doing something that new critics might find somewhat unhappy, right? Or that something that they may be unhappy about, because what you'll be doing is insisting upon a relationship between the world around the poet, right, and the poet writing the work of literature, and then also the relationship between the world, the poet, and the text that the poet produces. Okay. So that's all an example then of a particular term that's important for reading a work of literature in a particular way, from a particular position of critical investigation, what we might call post-structuralism, but really a lot of different modes of criticism put pressure on and investigate the discourses that works of literature adopt. And then also the problem itself, right? What is the problem under investigation, right? The problem I would be investigating in my example of education would be just education, or would be investment, or would be finance or economics, right? But in a literary text, it could be anything, right? It could be anything. So, okay, I hope that helps a little bit, and I just wanted to, one more time, to sort of streamline this for you. The kinds of terms we're talking about in class, the open problems, right? And they're not, this is not an exhaustive list of all the problems one could investigate in literature. It's just a nice, thorough list of, or thorough investigation of several important problems that has preoccupied literary studies for some time. So those would be beginning, right? Uncanny, desire, ideology, God, queer, pleasure, the end, war, right? These are super big open problems that you could investigate in your own work even, okay? And you would investigate them perhaps by positioning yourself in a relationship to, or a relationship within, a certain mode of criticism, right? From a particular perspective. And you might then do that in order to take advantage of the certain terms and tools that are associated with that mode of criticism. Okay. And equipped then with those tools, equipped them with the angle of vision that the mode of criticism provides, you can begin to investigate and problematize whatever idea is interesting you in a work of literature, even if it's not an idea, right, that is listed in the table of contents of your textbook. Okay. All right. Well, I think maybe that was a bit more helpful than the video I shot yesterday. So it's a little longer than the one I shot yesterday, but regardless, I think I'm going to put it up. And as you're hearing me say this, it's already up. So